Move the motion standing in my name. Thank you.
Senator Di Natale.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I think it's a fair thing to say that Australians love sport. It's at the centre of our culture. We are indeed a sporting country. We love to play sport. We love to watch sport. From playing backyard cricket at Mum's to packing the stands of the MCG for the AFL Grand Final, sport is part of the fabric of our lives. It has in fact played an important role in my own life. As a 10-year-old swimming for the Preston Swimming Club, I vividly remember diving into the ice-cold water of the 50-metre outdoor swimming pool on St George's Road in Preston each Sunday morning, looking at the stopwatch trying to beat my personal best time. I remember growing up in Reservoir in the northern suburbs of Melbourne and the fierce rivalry of the Dread Street versus Tormey Street cricket matches. I remember Dad being confused about the strange game of AFL and wanting his boy to play soccer and cheering from the sidelines during my stint at the North Reservoir Soccer Club. And I remember coming to love that strange game from the moment I watched my beloved team, the Mighty Tigers, thrash Collingwood in the 1980 Grand Final downstairs on a fuzzy black and white television. It was a journey that led me to play VFA footy, firstly with Coburg, incidentally under the tutelage of Phil Cleary, a former member of this parliament, and later with the Oakley Football Club in the VFA. Now my football days are over, and in my middle age I've discovered other pursuits, the joy of surfing, along with my colleague Senator Wish Wilson. I cycle when I can, I play a bit of golf, enjoy the odd game of cricket. When I do roll the arm over, it's with the Deans Marsh Swamp Rats, who, like many country sporting teams right around regional Australia, are an integral part of the local community. And my experience is no different to many Australians. It's why we make sport a priority in public policy. The Commonwealth spends over $170 million each year on elite sports through the Australian Institute of Sport. And Australia's famous around the world as a sporting nation. Despite being a small country, we're consistently near the top of the Olympic medal tally. Over the years, we have been world champions at cricket. We've led the tennis world. We've now got an Australian golfing champion in Adam Scott. We have come mighty close to beating the best at the world in the game of soccer. Now, I do know and understand that some people worry that we are a nation that's too obsessed with sport and that this obsession overshadows more important, more noble pursuits, things such as the arts and sciences. But yes, thank you, Senator Xenophon, sport is noble and it brings many, many good things. The tremendous health benefits of physical activity, learning to work in a team environment and respecting rules, respecting the umpire's final decision. Sport's a great leveller. It doesn't matter who you are, where you come from. Sport brings people together to share in the sheer joy of it. Now, that's not to say we can't do better to resource and recognise the great achievements of our artists and our scientists. We can and should do both. After all, it was the Greeks who gave us the marathon and the Olympics, along with Aristotle, medicine and the foundations of our modern democracy. But because Australians love sport so passionately, it is big business. Our major sporting codes such as Australian Rules Football and Rugby League have billion-dollar television deals. The Collingwood Football Club alone recorded a profit of almost $8 million last year. And the huge profits and increasing professionalism of our major sporting codes also has its downsides. Personally, I could do without the hype associated with going to a game of football. Overseas imports such as home and away jumpers that change each year just to bring in a bit more revenue, breaks in play being filled with the blast of music over the loudspeakers. I find it more than a trifle irritating, and I think that sports like the AFL are such great tests of strength and athleticism and endurance that they don't need those sorts of embellishments to survive. But there's been another much more important, more insidious and more corrosive change to our major sporting codes in recent years. It's now virtually impossible to watch any major sporting contest in this country without being urged to bet on the outcome, either during the advertising breaks or by commentators during the event, or indeed at the ground itself. The statistics reinforce the size and scope of the problem. Online betting, of which sports betting is a major component, has risen from $2.4 billion in 2007 to almost $10 billion in 2012. It's estimated that billions more are wagered by Australians on unregulated offshore gambling sites. Until recently, gambling was over there. It was the domain of bookies and horse racing. It was done in pokies venues and in casinos. But now it's over here. It's everywhere. It's playing an increasingly role in all our major sporting codes. And because of the potential for harm, there are some very serious questions that need to be answered about just how much we want gambling to be part of sport. I do accept that having a bet is part of Australian culture, and for many people it's an enjoyable activity. But you also need to accept that for some people who become problem gamblers, it is incredibly destructive. It's become increasingly difficult, if not impossible, to avoid repeated exposure to betting advertisements and gambling odds when watching sport. The number of sports betting ads on free-to-air TV quadrupled in the last 2 years. In 2012, there were 528 different ads collectively broadcast more than 20,000 times. There's also been a blurring of the line between commentary and advertising when it comes to gambling. The recent inclusion of a certain ubiquitous bookmaker, who's now appearing on the ground during rugby league coverage, has caused outrage amongst sports fans. Fans of all sports have noticed this growing link between sports and gambling companies. At best, they find it irritating. At worst, they worry about the impact it will have on their kids. This barrage of ads is making parents worried about whether a day at the footy or turning on the rugby league is still an appropriate family activity. A recent inquiry by the Joint Select Committee on Gambling Reform looked into the issue. We heard some disturbing evidence. For instance, researchers have interviewed children and found that the advertising is working on them. Kids can name 2 or 3 sports betting companies, those companies whose advertisements they've seen hundreds of times. I've personally heard from parents who have had children write odds onto their own artwork depicting the footy, or can themselves quote the odds before a match. Let's remember, this is a product that is aimed strictly at adults. But the fact that it's working its way into the consciousness of children has many people worried, including myself. I want my kids to be collecting footy cards, not recounting the odds of their favourite player winning the Brownlow medal. The reality is that gambling is not a harmless product. It's fun for some, but problem gambling costs us dearly. It destroys lives, it leaves kids unfed, it breaks up marriages, homes are lost. For a product with this potential for harm, there is a very clear role for government to regulate. Now, I don't propose a ban. I think it's perfectly appropriate that an activity that is so popular remains legal, and banning it would just drive it to unregulated markets overseas or to black markets onshore, leaving those sports open to corruption. On the other hand, not regulating could lead us down a very dangerous road. If we don't act now, gambling will become so enmeshed in sport, we'll never be able to separate the two again. And that's going to have one consequence, and one consequence only: more problem gamblers. Now, we have tried self-regulation. Nearly 2 years ago, the government gave an ultimatum to the industry regarding the repetition of live odds during sports. Either sort yourselves out, curb the practice, or the government will act. A year later, they reached an agreement, and broadcasters have since publicised updates to their codes of conduct. But these new codes are comical when you compare them to the extent of the problem. Promotion can continue as before during scheduled breaks. We'll still see live betting odds. And worse still, there's nothing stopping bookmakers and betting company representatives appearing during commentary sections of the broadcast. These codes do nothing to fix the problem. They allow the nexus between televised sport and gambling to continue on its current trajectory. More exposure, more linking, more problem gambling. Betting becoming an integral part of the game. The scope of the problem and the path we're on raises real potential for harm to kids. We are still gathering the evidence, that's true, but it is inherently obvious that kids for whom gambling has become a normalised part of life are more likely to gamble later in life. That's been the experience of other harmful products such as tobacco. They'll gamble and gamble heavily. Problem gambling is the inevitable result. That's why the time has come for this Parliament to step in and do something about this harm. The motion before the Chamber lists several important reforms that will help mitigate this potential for harm. They're simple steps, they won't place an undue burden on the industry, but they will start to disentangle gambling from sport. Children are not the ostensible targets of gambling ads, and we must stop this brainwashing of young children. The industry claims that they're not trying to recruit new customers from among their ranks, so it's right that children be the first priority of new reforms. One obvious reform to prevent the overexposure of children to these ads is to limit the times at which they may be broadcast. The loophole that allows gambling ads to be broadcast at any time of the day, so long as they're part of the sports broadcast, has to be closed. How would we feel if gambling ads popped up during morning cartoons, next to the ads for Barbie dolls and Cocoa Pops? We wouldn't accept it. But this is the situation we have now when it comes to the broadcast of live sport. The proposal to ban gambling ads before 9 p.m. is therefore a sensible one. Adults will still see the ads, the industry can continue to advertise, but the number of children who are exposed to these ads will be significantly reduced. The promotion of live odds is one of the most intrusive ways that sports betting companies can promote their service. It's an inducement to gamble right now. As I said before, these numbers are noticed by children, many of whom think it's just part of the way the game now works. There's no reason that we should allow this barrage of numbers to continue. Sports betting companies can tell us to have a punt, but they don't need to be listing the odds to do it. So we should stop this practice completely. The other important and necessary reform is the end to so-called cash for comment. An outrage that's generated real outrage with sporting fans is the inclusion of bookies as part of the editorial team. It must be a lucrative business because the reaction from fans to the appearance of Tom Waterhouse on the NRL Rugby League broadcast was astonishing. It unleashed a torrent of fury. The goodwill this has cost the broadcasters and the sporting code is enormous. Many people have expressed their outrage to me personally, and social media lights up any time this issue is raised. The broadcasters have contended that by changing the logo on Tom Waterhouse's microphone, the distinction between commentator and sponsor is now crystal clear. But for a young kid watching a game of footy, Tom Waterhouse, the bookmaker, is no different from Tom Waterhouse, the commentator. When I saw a photograph of Mr. Waterhouse signing kids' jerseys after a match, I have to say, like many people, it was the last straw. The intent of the code is to separate commentary from betting, to separate the commentators from the bookmakers. But children are not equipped to make that distinction. How could they, if that's all they've ever known of a sporting broadcast? It comes on top of the constant repetition of sports betting brand names into the commentary at every opportune moment. We've got to stop this practice, and we've got to start talking about the sport and not the betting. The time has come for this parliament to take action. We can very easily legislate to stop the bombardment of betting odds. We can very easily legislate to close the loophole that lets ads run when kids are most likely to be watching. And we need to turn sport back over to the experts, to the sports tragics, to the fans, and not give it over to the bookmakers and the spruikers. Mr Acting Deputy President, we are at a crossroads when it comes to sport. If we don't act now, a trip to the footy will soon be like a trip to the racetrack. We have the opportunity to take action. These are simple reforms, they're necessary reforms, and they're popular reforms. With the stroke of a pen, we can let the sport do the talking and not the bookmakers. By passing legislation that implements these reforms, the Parliament would be setting us back on the path that preserves the sport's